Greetings everyone, my name is Dr. Jason Freeman. I'd like to welcome you all to my channel. I took my first trip to England back in 2013. I've been back twice since, once in January of 2023 and this past January of 2024. And each time Brits have let me know some things that they find perplexing about America, whether it be the people that I co-teach my study abroad course with, or just people that I run into at a Greg's getting a strawberry jammy, which is delicious, by the way. So one thing that Brits find weird or perplexing or just strange about the country is just how big we are. In regards to total square mileage or kilometers, the US is the third largest country in the world behind Russia and Canada. While England, by comparison, is roughly the size of the US state of Oregon. I think where the size really comes into play when it comes to kind of the weirdness of America through the eyes of Brits is that we have so many regions that are very different from each other. The American South versus the Northeast, the West Coast versus the Southwest. It's just almost like different nations within one umbrella. So when one Oxford professor talked to me about how he had no interest in visiting America because of our gun-obsessed culture, I pointed out the fact that there's a lot of diversity even among regions within the country, where there are many regions that are much more like Britain in regards to their views of guns compared to the American South, which is very much the opposite. Also, being a Marylander who has family in North Carolina, I routinely make 6-hour drives to the south, to the state of North Carolina. If you drive 6 hours from, say, Birmingham to anywhere, you're either in Scotland or somewhere in continental Europe. The second thing that Brits find weird or perplexing about America that is related to our size is our relative ignorance of the rest of the world.
Are you registered Democrat?
Republican.
Republican. Can you name a country on this map?
Somebody does Africa?
Nope.
Russia?
Nope, that's China. Anything over here?
All right, so basically Europe.
Where's
China.
Europe?
Now there are some things that the average American might have some knowledge about in regards to kind of the international community, such as the ongoing conflict in Gaza or Brexit. But there's a lot of stuff the average American wouldn't know about. So for example, there was a genocide in Sri Lanka. Also, in China, you have a group called the Uyghurs, who are mainly Muslim, who are oppressed. I would even dare say that a lot of Americans aren't really even aware of the conflict or the tensions between Taiwan and China, or why those tensions exist. One of the reasons I teach a study abroad course in England is to try to increase the knowledge that my students at Towson University have about the world at large. There's a bit of an insularity that we as Americans have that travel has a good way of kind of doing away with. The problem, however, is that for a lot of Americans, travel includes travel within the continental US, and why not? We have a huge country. We have tall mountains, we have forest, we have beaches, we have canyons. It's a pretty varied landscape in the continental US, and then of course you have Alaska and Hawaii. But for a British person to get the same kind of experience in regard to experiencing these different landscapes, for the most part they have to leave Britain. So if you want to see, these vast deserts, you might want to go to North Africa. These huge mountains, maybe go to the Alps. There are, of course, beaches in Britain, but there's also, beaches in the Mediterranean, so in different countries like Spain, for example. And so again, while in America we have the options to stay within our own country, with our own language and our own kind of different American culture, for Brits they have to be able to expand and go to different places with different language groups, with different cultures in order to have the same experiences. Now, the third thing that a lot of Brits find weird or perplexing about America is our obsession with guns. Now, we could partially thank the Brits for this. So when the American colonies were under British control, there were what we consider restrictive gun laws. And so one of the things that the American colonists did after they gained independence was to put in the Constitution the ability or the right to own guns. Now, where we have diverged the most is how that particular right has been interpreted over the years. In recent years, gun ownership in America has been seen more of it as an absolute right, where even in states where guns have been highly regulated, the U.S. Supreme Court has affirmed the right for people to own guns for self-defense. While in England, handguns have largely been banned since 1997 after the Dunblane massacre, where 16 students and one teacher were killed in a shooting in Scotland. And so when I talk to Brits about America, one thing that comes up over and over again is the proliferation of guns, where in the United States you can actually buy guns in places like Walmart or Dick's Sporting Goods. And of course that leads to mass shootings, where the U.S. has a relative high number of mass shootings compared to other parts of the world. Now, the fourth thing that, especially in recent years, has come up that really shocked Brits or perplexed Brits about America is the popularity of Donald J. Trump. Now, I know, especially after seeing Piers Morgan, that there are Brits who do, like and admire Donald Trump. I just haven't met any of them. And even working class white Brits who I've interacted with who, in America would have likely seemed to be in the conservative side, seem to have kind of a negative view of Trump. So I've been in lobbies talking to people, and Trump pops up on the screen, and immediately the bafflement kind of occurs as to why is this guy popular. And one thing that's really difficult to communicate is that even, in a blue state like Maryland where I live, if you go outside the cities, you'll see, Trump signs. You even see some around in the city as well, where the perception is a clear divide between the North and the South. But again, when you get out of these urban areas, you see a lot more Trump support, and I think a lot of Brits just don't really get why. And it probably doesn't help that the BBC doesn't seem to be very sympathetic toward Trump. I'm not saying, whether it should or shouldn't either way, but I think that has a big impact on his view or how he's seen over there compared to in the southern United States or, the middle of the country or like the Southwest. And so the last thing that baffles or perplexes Brits about America really comes down to something that's very fundamental about the country, which is American-style racism. America is a very segregated country. We have cities that are majority black, and many more cities are majority white. And even within cities, you have black areas versus white areas, which happens in Britain, but just not to the same extent. Now, another factor is that Britain is 80% white, where America it's around 70%, and that number is falling. And also there's the history of slavery in the U.S. versus in Britain. So in Britain, there was a whole view that slavery is not something that happens here. While it did happen, it just wasn't to the same extent as we see in places like Mississippi, South Carolina, my home state of North Carolina. And there's a whole history of Jim Crow in the United States, where there were laws as recently as the 1960s that basically said no blacks allowed in certain places based on state law. And while in Britain you didn't really have that, you did have signs that said, no blacks, no dogs, no Irish. But it still was not the kind of codified institutional segregation that we had here in the U.S. And so the result is that in British society, based on my observations, you have a much more integrated society, that you don't necessarily have the same racial barriers that we have here in the U.S. It's not to say there isn't racism. Absolutely is racism. And part of my course that I teach talks about the history of racism in Britain. Is just that as in regards to an integrated society, I would say the United States is not anywhere close to be as integrated as Britain. And one situation that really codified it or kind of locked it down for me was I was at a Greg's in London. Greg's is a kind of a breakfast pastry place. And so I went there to get a strawberry jam, which again is delicious. And so while I was there, there was a woman, a British woman of African descent who had a headscarf on. And when I made my order, she first asked me, oh, are you Canadian or American based on my accent? And I told her I was American. And the question she asked me was, is America as racist as it seems? And it kind of caught me off guard because it's one of those things that I don't oftentimes notice how racist some of the things how different it is in the United States versus Britain. But I can imagine somebody from Britain who grew up in a society that, while it did have racism, it just wasn't quite as racially segregated. Coming to America and essentially being profiled, being looked at not only as, you know, a black person in a negative light, but also as a Muslim. And so, you know, I really couldn't give her a good answer. I basically said in some places, absolutely, especially if you're in some parts of the South, Mississippi, Texas, in certain areas, it's going to be very, you know, dangerous or very unwelcome to be a black Muslim woman, but there are many other places where you'll be perfectly fine. It's just how, you know, again, going back to the size of the country, it depends on where you are. Now, if you found that video interesting and or informative, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. Also, please share this video. And if you have other questions about differences between American and British society, please leave those questions in the comment section below. Thank you all for your time and have a wonderful rest of your day.